Have you ever seen a car that was both a massive success and a complete failure at the same time? A car that sold like hotcakes when it first came out, but just a few years later, people wanted nothing to do with it. That's exactly what happened with the 1980 Chevrolet Citation. When it was launched, it was praised as the car that would redefine General Motors. It was modern, fuel-efficient, and packed with innovations that seemed perfect for the new era. But just as quickly as it rose to fame, it crashed into controversy. Owners started experiencing serious problems, recalls followed, and GM's reputation took a massive hit. So, what really happened? Was the Citation a revolutionary leap forward or one of the biggest blunders in GM's history? Stick around until the end, because by the time you finish this video, you'll know why the Citation was loved by many, hated by even more, and why it remains one of the most debated cars in GM's history. A car born out of crisis. To understand why the Chevrolet Citation was so important, we need to step back into the 1970s. This was a tough time for American car manufacturers. Gas prices were soaring due to the 1973 oil crisis, and suddenly, the big, gas-guzzling cars that Americans loved were becoming a problem. People needed smaller, more fuel-efficient cars, something that Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda had already figured out. At the same time, strict new emission and safety regulations were being introduced. GM, Ford, and Chrysler had no choice but to rethink the way they built cars. They needed something different, something that could compete with the fuel-efficient imports and satisfy the changing needs of American drivers. And so, GM came up with an answer, the Chevrolet Citation, a car built on the brand new X-body platform. This was a radical shift for General Motors. It was their first front-wheel drive compact car, designed to be light, efficient, and spacious. The idea was simple: take the practicality of European and Japanese cars, but make it American. When GM unveiled the Citation in 1979 as a 1980 model, it seemed like they had hit the jackpot. It was marketed as the perfect car for a new era, one that offered the fuel savings people needed, the space they wanted, and the driving experience they were looking for. Why it was so revolutionary? If you were used to driving a traditional American sedan from the 1960s or 1970s, the Citation felt like a breath of fresh air. Most American cars of that time were rear-wheel drive, heavy, and built on old-school body-on-frame designs. The Citation, on the other hand, was a unibody car with front-wheel drive, making it much lighter and more efficient. One of its biggest selling points was space efficiency. Because it didn't have a bulky rear-wheel drive layout, the Citation had much more interior room than other compact cars of its size. It even came in a hatchback version, something that was far more common in Europe than in the US at the time. The numbers also worked in its favor. The Citation was about 800 pounds lighter than the Chevy Nova it replaced. It had a 2.5L Iron Duke four-cylinder engine as standard, with an optional 2.8L V6 for those who wanted more power. It was fuel-efficient, practical, and, at least on paper, exactly what American families needed. A record-breaking success, at first. When the Chevrolet Citation went on sale in April 1979, the response was unbelievable. In its first model year alone, GM sold more than 800,000 units, a number that most carmakers could only dream of. The Citation was everywhere, and for a short time, it seemed like GM had finally cracked the code. It even won the prestigious Motor Trend Car of the Year award in 1980, which further boosted its reputation. At first, people genuinely loved it. It was modern, different, and felt like a step into the future. But as history would soon prove, success doesn't always last. Cracks begin to show. It didn't take long for problems to surface. The Citation was GM's first attempt at mass-producing a front-wheel drive car, and it showed. Owners began experiencing serious issues, from faulty brakes to transmission failures, steering problems, and poor build quality. What started as small complaints turned into widespread frustration. By 1981, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, was flooded with reports about the Citation's brake failures. In some cases, the brakes locked up unexpectedly, causing dangerous driving situations. Eventually, GM was forced to issue a massive recall, affecting over 1.1 million citations. And that's when the tide turned. People who had initially praised the Citation started losing trust in GM. Customers who once thought they had bought a car of the future now felt like they had been sold an unfinished experiment. Word of mouth spread quickly, and by 1983, sales had plummeted. By 1985, GM had no choice but to pull the plug on the Citation altogether. A love-hate relationship. The Chevrolet Citation is one of those rare cars that represents both the best and the worst of General Motors. It was a car that pushed American automotive design forward, yet at the same time, it exposed GM's biggest weaknesses: rushed engineering and quality control issues. For those who owned one in the early days, it was an exciting new option that felt ahead of its time. But for those who had to deal with its reliability problems, it became a symbol of GM's decline in the 1980s. And yet, even today, the Citation still has a small but dedicated following. Some car enthusiasts see it as an important piece of history, while others remember it as a cautionary tale of what happens when a company rushes to innovate without getting the details right. The Chevrolet Citation wasn't just another car, it was a response to a crisis that shook the entire American auto industry. To understand why General Motors took such a radical step with the Citation, we have to go back to the 1970s, a decade that turned the automotive world upside down. For decades, American cars had followed a simple formula: big, powerful, and built like tanks. The V8 engine was king, fuel efficiency was an afterthought, and size was a symbol of status. If you drove a Chevrolet Impala or a Cadillac Eldorado in the late 60s, you were part of the great American dream. Gas was cheap, roads were wide, and no one cared about miles per gallon. But everything changed in 1973, when the oil crisis hit like a wrecking ball. The world watched as fuel prices skyrocketed overnight, and suddenly, those massive American cars felt like a burden instead of a luxury. People who had never worried about gas costs before were now lining up at gas stations, waiting hours just to fill their tanks. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a wake-up call. The rules had changed, and American automakers were completely unprepared. The rise of the imports. While Detroit was struggling to adapt, Japanese and European automakers were gaining momentum. Companies like Toyota, Honda, and Volkswagen had been building small, fuel-efficient cars for years. They weren't just selling cars, they were selling solutions to the fuel crisis. Take the 1973 Toyota Corolla, for example. It was compact, reliable, and delivered over 30 miles per gallon, a number that made American sedans look outdated overnight. The Honda Civic, introduced in 1972, was another game-changer. It was affordable, well-built, and could easily go twice as far on a tank of gas compared to an American V8. By the mid-1970s, American drivers were switching to imports in record numbers. The old belief that foreign cars are too small and weak was disappearing fast. People saw them as smart choices, especially younger buyers and middle-class families who wanted reliable, affordable transportation. Meanwhile, American automakers were struggling to catch up. Companies like GM, Ford, and Chrysler had spent decades focusing on power and luxury. Now, they were forced to rethink everything. The government steps in, new rules for a new era. As if the fuel crisis wasn't enough, American car manufacturers were hit with another challenge: strict government regulations. In the 1970s, both emission laws and safety standards became much tougher. For the first time, cars had to meet fuel economy targets. The corporate average fuel economy, CAFE, standards, introduced in 1975, forced automakers to build more fuel-efficient vehicles, or face heavy penalties. At the same time, the Clean Air Act made it mandatory for car companies to reduce pollution. That meant adding complex emission control systems like catalytic converters, which further reduced power and performance in traditional American V8s. And then there were safety regulations. The government required stronger bumpers, crash protection, and seatbelt laws, making old designs obsolete. The golden age of massive, chrome-covered gas guzzlers was officially over. General Motors' big gamble. By the late 1970s, GM had a choice: adapt or fall behind. The company had already lost market share to Japanese and European competitors, and they couldn't afford another decade of decline. The answer was a completely new kind of car. A car that was smaller, lighter, more fuel-efficient, and ready for the future. But simply shrinking an old model wasn't enough. GM had to reinvent the American car from the ground up. That's when the X-Body platform was born. This was a radical shift. GM had never built a front-wheel drive compact car before. They had always relied on rear-wheel drive, body-on-frame designs, a setup that had worked for decades. But now, the world was changing, and front-wheel drive was the future. The Chevrolet Citation was designed to be the flagship of this new era. It was compact but spacious inside. It was fuel-efficient but still had enough power for American highways. It was supposed to compete directly with the Honda Accord, Volkswagen Rabbit, and Toyota Corolla, and beat them at their own game. Why front-wheel drive was a game-changer? Front-wheel drive wasn't just a new feature, it was a complete shift in automotive design. In a traditional rear-wheel drive car, the engine sends power to the back wheels, requiring a long drive shaft and a heavy rear axle. This added weight, took up space, and made the car less fuel-efficient. With front-wheel drive, the engine and transmission were combined into one compact unit at the front of the car. This had huge advantages. More interior space, without a bulky drive shaft and rear differential, GM could offer a bigger cabin in a smaller car. Better fuel economy, less weight meant the car used less fuel, perfect for the post-oil crisis world. Improved traction, since the front wheels did both the steering and the driving, the Citation handled better in rain and snow, making it ideal for North American roads. On paper, it all made sense. The Chevrolet Citation wasn't just another compact car, it was a symbol of GM's future. The company was so confident in it that they decided to bet everything on it. The rush to production. GM pushed the Citation to market as fast as possible. They knew the demand for fuel-efficient cars was growing, and they didn't want to lose more customers to imports. The car was unveiled in April 1979, months ahead of schedule. At first, it looked like a brilliant move. Customers flooded dealerships, eager to buy what GM was calling a revolutionary new driving experience. The company was so confident in the Citation's success that it built 4 different versions: a 2-door coupe, a 4-door sedan, and even a 5-door hatchback. And for a while, it worked. The Citation was an instant hit, with sales soaring to nearly 1 million units in its first year. It was GM's best-selling compact car ever, and for a moment, it seemed like the company had turned the tide. But here's the problem: rushing a new car to market comes with risks. And GM was about to learn that the hard way. Because while the Citation looked perfect on the outside, trouble was brewing under the hood. Excitement filled Chevrolet dealerships across the country. The Citation was supposed to be a game-changer, the car that would lead General Motors into the future. It was compact yet spacious, powerful yet fuel-efficient, and packed with modern features. Buyers lined up to get their hands on it, and in its first year alone, GM sold nearly 1 million units. But success, as history would prove, was short-lived. What started as a revolution quickly turned into a disaster. Owners soon discovered that their brand-new Citations had serious problems, and as complaints piled up, GM's reputation took a massive hit. The quality control disaster. To meet skyrocketing demand, GM rushed production of the Citation. Factories worked at full speed, pushing out cars as fast as possible. But there was a problem: corners were being cut. The company's focus wasn't on precision or reliability, it was on getting cars out the door. This resulted in a quality control nightmare. Citations were leaving the factory with misaligned doors, rattling dashboards, and poor paint jobs. Some had faulty brakes right off the assembly line. Others had suspension components that weren't properly secured. Owners quickly realized that their new cars weren't built with the same level of craftsmanship they had come to expect from GM. One of the biggest complaints was rust. The Citation had been designed with weight savings in mind, but the thin metal panels and lack of proper corrosion protection meant that these cars started rusting almost immediately. In regions with harsh winters, like the Midwest and the Northeast, Citations were developing rust spots within a year of purchase. For many loyal GM customers, this was a betrayal. They had trusted Chevrolet, a company with decades of reliability, but now they were left with cars that felt cheap and unfinished. The infamous braking problem. Of all the Citation's issues, the braking system was arguably the most dangerous. Owners reported that under hard braking, the car would pull sharply to one side, making it difficult, if not impossible, to keep control. This wasn't a minor issue. It was a serious safety hazard, and it quickly became the focus of national attention. The problem stemmed from the Citation's front disc and rear drum brake setup. GM's engineering team had designed the system to be lightweight and efficient, but in real-world driving, it led to severe brake imbalance. If the driver applied the brakes too hard, the front wheels could lock up while the rear wheels kept rolling, causing the car to swerve unpredictably. The situation became so dangerous that the U.S. government had to step in. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, launched an investigation, and eventually, GM was forced to recall hundreds of thousands of Citations. But even after repairs, many owners never fully trusted their cars again. The transmission trouble. As if unreliable brakes weren't enough, Citation owners also faced major transmission issues. The car was available with a 3-speed automatic or a 4-speed manual, but both had serious design flaws. The automatic transmission was known for sudden failures, often leaving drivers stranded on the road. Some would refuse to shift properly, while others would jerk violently between gears. The manual version wasn't any better. The clutch was stiff and imprecise, making shifting a frustrating experience. Worse yet, some manual transmissions failed completely within the first few years, forcing costly repairs. For a car that was supposed to bring GM into the future, this was a disaster. Instead of competing with the Toyota Corolla or Volkswagen Rabbit, the Citation was quickly earning a reputation as unreliable and poorly built. The lawsuits and the reputation damage. By the early 1980s, frustration among Citation owners had reached a boiling point. Complaints flooded consumer advocacy groups, and lawsuits began piling up against General Motors. The car that was supposed to be Chevrolet's new beginning had turned into one of its biggest embarrassments. Even GM's own dealers lost faith in the Citation. Mechanics struggled to fix the car's constant problems, and warranty claims skyrocketed. For every satisfied owner, there were dozens of frustrated ones dealing with brake failures, rust, and transmission breakdowns. Consumer Reports, one of the most respected automotive review sources, was harsh in its assessment of the Citation. They labeled it one of the most unreliable cars GM had ever built, and by the mid-1980s, the car's resale value had plummeted. How the Citation damaged GM's trust. The real tragedy of the Citation wasn't just that it had mechanical issues, it was that it damaged GM's reputation in a way that would take decades to repair. Before the Citation, General Motors was seen as the gold standard of American car manufacturing. Yes, foreign competitors were gaining ground, but many Americans still trusted GM brands over imports. But the Citation changed that. It proved that GM was no longer putting quality first. It showed that they were rushing products to market without proper testing. And worst of all, it made loyal GM customers start looking elsewhere. By the late 1980s, more and more Americans were buying Japanese cars. Brands like Honda, Toyota, and Nissan had built their reputations on reliability. They didn't have rushed designs or quality control disasters, they built cars that lasted. For GM, this was a painful lesson. The Citation, once hailed as the future, had instead become a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit's approach to the compact car market. It had started as a car that millions loved, but by the end, it was a car that millions regretted buying. For decades, General Motors had built its reputation on trust, reliability, and American craftsmanship. The Chevrolet Citation was supposed to reinforce that legacy, but instead, it became one of the company's greatest disappointments. What hurt most wasn't just the car's flaws, it was the way GM handled the backlash. Loyal GM customers had spent their hard-earned money on what they believed was the future of American cars. But when things started going wrong, they weren't just dealing with mechanical failures, they were dealing with a company that refused to take full responsibility. The recall that came too late. By the time GM finally acknowledged the Citation's safety issues, it was already too late. The damage had been done. Customers had spent months, or even years, fighting with dealerships, mechanics, and corporate representatives over brake failures, rust, and transmission breakdowns. When the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, launched its investigation into the Citation's faulty brakes, GM initially downplayed the problem. They claimed it was an isolated issue, affecting only a small percentage of cars. But as more and more cases emerged, it became clear that this wasn't an exception, it was a widespread defect. Eventually, GM was forced to issue a massive recall, affecting hundreds of thousands of Citations. Owners were told to bring their cars in for repairs, but the solution wasn't as simple as replacing a single part. The braking system itself had been poorly engineered, and even after the recall, many drivers reported that their Citations still didn't feel safe. For a company that had built its reputation on dependability, this was an unforgivable mistake. Customers didn't just lose trust in the Citation, they lost trust in Chevrolet itself. The dealership struggles, a nightmare for mechanics. It wasn't just car owners who suffered. Chevrolet dealerships across America faced an overwhelming number of complaints. Mechanics were constantly dealing with frustrated customers, trying to fix cars that were fundamentally flawed from the factory. Unlike previous Chevrolet models, which had been built on proven, time-tested platforms, the Citation was part of a new front-wheel drive experiment. Many mechanics weren't even properly trained to work on these cars. Technicians found themselves dealing with unpredictable electrical failures, brake malfunctions, and transmission issues that weren't easy to diagnose. GM provided service bulletins, but these were temporary fixes, not long-term solutions. As warranty claims skyrocketed, some dealerships even started refusing to take in Citations for major repairs. It simply wasn't worth the time or effort. The cars were so unreliable that fixing one problem often led to another issue down the road. This left many owners feeling abandoned. They had bought a car from America's most trusted automaker, but when things went wrong, they were met with excuses instead of solutions. The media turns against GM. It wasn't long before the Citation's reputation went national. Automotive journalists, consumer advocacy groups, and even mainstream news outlets started covering the growing list of issues. Consumer Reports, which had initially given the Citation a positive review, quickly reversed its stance after testing the car under real-world conditions. The magazine warned readers about its brake failures and criticized GM's lack of quality control. Other publications weren't any kinder. Car and Driver called the Citation one of the most disappointing cars GM had ever made. Road and Track highlighted the poor build quality and dangerous handling. For decades, General Motors had relied on positive press to help sell its cars. But now, that same press was exposing its biggest failure. Even network television got involved. Investigative reports highlighted customer complaints, showing footage of rusted-out Citations and interviewing frustrated owners who had been stranded by engine or transmission failures. For GM, this wasn't just bad press, it was a public relations disaster. The company had hoped that the Citation would prove its ability to innovate, but instead, it had become a symbol of everything wrong with American cars. The sales collapse and the beginning of the end. Despite its rocky start, the Citation continued to sell well for a few years. Many Americans, unaware of the car's growing problems, still trusted the Chevrolet name. But by 1982, word had spread. Sales plummeted, and dealerships struggled to move new Citations off their lots. GM attempted to update the Citation with small improvements. They offered better interior materials, made slight adjustments to the suspension, and even introduced a sportier model to attract younger buyers. But by this point, the damage was too severe. By the mid-1980s, resale values had collapsed. A car that had once been hailed as the future of GM was now one of the cheapest used cars on the market. For General Motors, the Citation wasn't just a failed model, it was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a long and painful decline. Once the undisputed king of the American auto industry, GM was now losing customers to Honda, Toyota, and Nissan, companies that built cars that were smaller, more efficient, and far more reliable. The Citation had started as a car millions of Americans wanted. But by the end, it was a car millions of Americans regretted. The Chevrolet Citation was more than just a failed car. It was a moment of reckoning for General Motors. What was meant to be a revolution in American engineering ended up exposing the cracks in GM's foundation, cracks that would take decades to repair. By the mid-1980s, the damage was undeniable. The Citation was still on sale, but sales numbers had collapsed. Dealerships were flooded with unsold inventory, and buyers who once trusted GM were now looking elsewhere. The Citation had become a symbol of rushed engineering, poor quality control, and corporate arrogance. How the Citation changed GM's approach to quality. For decades, General Motors had operated with a sense of invincibility. It was the largest car manufacturer in the world, and it had dominated the American market for generations. But the Citation's failure proved that brand loyalty had limits. Customers were no longer willing to accept poor quality just because a car had a Chevrolet badge on it. The rise of Japanese automakers had shown Americans that cars could be reliable, efficient, and well-built, something the Citation clearly was not. The backlash forced GM to rethink its approach to quality control. In the years that followed, the company invested heavily in factory improvements, bringing in robotic assembly lines and stricter inspection protocols. But by the time these changes took effect, GM had already lost a significant portion of its customer base. Many buyers who had owned a Citation never returned to Chevrolet again. Instead, they switched to Honda, Toyota, or Nissan, brands that had proven themselves to be more trustworthy. The Citation's impact on future GM models. The Citation may have been a disaster, but it did teach GM some painful lessons. Later models, like the Chevrolet Cavalier, were designed with improved reliability in mind. GM also began offering longer warranties to reassure skeptical customers. But the damage wasn't just to GM's compact cars. The Citation's failure made Americans question the entire General Motors lineup. If the company was willing to cut corners on a mass-market car, what did that say about its other vehicles? By the late 1980s, GM's market share was shrinking, and the company was scrambling to win back consumer trust. The Citation had been designed to compete with the imports, but instead, it pushed more people toward foreign brands. The financial cost of the Citation's failure. The Citation wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a financial disaster for GM. The company had invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the X-body platform, expecting it to carry them into the next decade. But instead of a long-term success, GM had created a short-lived catastrophe. By 1985, the Citation was quietly discontinued, along with the other X-body models. GM tried to move forward, but the losses were staggering. Not only had they spent millions on recalls and warranty repairs, but they had also lost millions of potential future customers. For a company that had once dominated the industry, this was a humiliating fall from grace. How the Citation contributed to GM's long-term decline. The Chevrolet Citation was just one piece of a much larger problem. In the years that followed, General Motors continued to struggle with cost-cutting measures, declining quality, and outdated designs. By the early 1990s, GM's reputation was in free fall. While Toyota and Honda were introducing cars that could last for decades, GM was still producing vehicles that felt cheap and unreliable. The impact of the Citation's failure lingered for decades. It wasn't just about one bad car. It was about what that car represented. It showed that GM was willing to put profits ahead of quality, and it proved that American automakers could no longer afford to ignore the competition. The lesson was clear: the automotive world had changed, but GM had not changed with it. And for many, the Chevrolet Citation became the perfect example of why Detroit was losing its grip on the industry. Why the Citation is still remembered today. Decades later, the Chevrolet Citation remains one of GM's most infamous failures. It wasn't just a bad car, it was a turning point. Today, the Citation is often remembered as one of the worst cars of the 1980s, but it's also a reminder of what happens when a company ignores its customers. GM thought that brand loyalty would keep people coming back, but the Citation proved that trust has to be earned. For the people who owned one, the Citation wasn't just a disappointment, it was a betrayal. And for GM, it was a painful lesson that came at a massive cost. The Chevrolet Citation had gone from a celebrated innovation to a cautionary tale in just a few years. What started as General Motors' most ambitious project had become a symbol of corporate failure. But GM was not ready to admit defeat. As the complaints piled up and customer trust continued to erode, GM scrambled to save the Citation's reputation. The company made repeated attempts to fix the car's biggest flaws, rebrand its image, and convince Americans that it was still a worthy choice. But as history has shown, once a car earns a bad reputation, it's nearly impossible to erase. The mid-cycle improvements, too little, too late. By 1981, the backlash against the Citation was in full force. Reports of brake failures, transmission problems, and rust issues were everywhere. GM quickly realized that if they didn't act fast, the Citation's sales would collapse entirely. To combat the growing criticism, GM made several updates to the Citation, hoping to fix its worst flaws. Braking system overhaul. After receiving thousands of complaints and facing a government recall, GM modified the Citation's braking system. The company replaced some components and adjusted the brake bias, claiming it would improve stopping performance. But for many owners, the damage was already done. Trust in the car's safety had been shattered. Better build quality. Supposedly GM promised that later Citation models had improved assembly quality, but in reality, the changes were minimal. Poor panel alignment, rattling interiors, and mechanical failures still plagued the car. The rushed production methods that caused the issues in the first place were never truly addressed. New sportier models. To attract younger buyers, GM introduced the Citation X11, a high-performance version of the car. It featured a sportier suspension, upgraded tires, and a more powerful V6 engine. But despite these upgrades, it couldn't escape the car's core problems. Even with better handling and power, the X11 still suffered from the same reliability concerns as the base model. While these changes were marketed as major improvements, they were ultimately band-aid solutions. GM was trying to fix deep-rooted design flaws with surface-level adjustments, and consumers weren't fooled. Desperate marketing. GM's last-ditch efforts to convince buyers. As word spread about the Citation's issues, GM launched aggressive marketing campaigns to regain public confidence. The company poured millions into advertising, pushing the idea that the Citation was a modern, fuel-efficient, and reliable choice. TV commercials showcased happy families driving their Citations across America, while print ads emphasized the car's advanced engineering and award-winning design. GM even leaned on the Citation's past recognition as Motor Trend's 1980 Car of the Year, using it as proof that the car was still a great option. But there was a problem: the public wasn't buying it anymore. The Citation's real-world performance didn't match GM's marketing promises, and word of mouth spread faster than any ad campaign could repair. Consumer Reports, which had once praised the Citation, now warned buyers to stay away from it. Automotive journalists criticized GM for trying to sugarcoat the truth, and used car values for the Citation began plummeting at record speed. Even dealerships, GM's own sales network, were losing faith. Many dealers struggled to move Citations off their lots, offering heavy discounts just to get rid of them. In some cases, they actively discouraged customers from buying one, steering them toward more reliable models instead. The unavoidable sales collapse. Despite GM's attempts to revive the Citation, sales declined sharply. The car had debuted with record-breaking numbers in 1980, but by 1983, sales had dropped by nearly half. By 1985, the Citation was a financial liability, and GM made the inevitable decision to pull the plug. The company tried to quietly phase out the Citation without drawing too much attention to its failure. Instead of acknowledging the car's issues, GM simply stopped talking about it, shifting focus to its next generation of compact cars. But for many former Citation owners, the damage was permanent. The car had shattered their trust in GM, and a significant number of them never bought a Chevrolet again. The bigger lesson: why the Citation's failure still matters. The Chevrolet Citation wasn't just a bad car, it was a warning sign. It exposed the dangers of corporate shortcuts, rushed innovation, and ignoring customer concerns. GM had gambled everything on a bold new design, but when problems arose, the company chose denial over accountability. The failure of the Citation contributed to a long-term decline in GM's reputation. It forced the company to rethink its approach to quality control, but by the time real changes were made, many consumers had already moved on to more reliable brands. To this day, the Citation remains one of the most infamous failures in automotive history. It serves as a powerful reminder that no company, no matter how big, can afford to take its customers for granted. Time has a way of softening even the harshest judgments, but for the Chevrolet Citation, that never happened. Decades later, it remains a car that sparks strong reactions, from frustration to disappointment, and in some cases, even nostalgia. For some, the Citation was a missed opportunity, a car that could have redefined General Motors but instead became a cautionary tale. For others, it was simply one of the worst cars they ever owned. But regardless of personal opinions, one thing is certain: the Citation left a lasting mark on the automotive world. Why the Citation is still remembered today. Most cars from the early 1980s have faded into history, replaced by newer models and forgotten by all but the most dedicated collectors. But the Citation remains a topic of conversation for one simple reason: it represents everything that was wrong with GM during that era. It wasn't just a bad car, it was a broken promise. It was supposed to be the future of American automobiles, proof that GM could adapt to changing times. Instead, it became a symbol of outdated corporate thinking and poor execution. The Citation is also remembered because of how dramatically it fell from grace. When it first launched, it was met with excitement and enthusiasm. It won awards, set sales records, and looked like a true game-changer. But within a few short years, it became one of GM's most embarrassing failures. That kind of dramatic reversal isn't easily forgotten. The collectability of the Citation: is it a classic? With many older cars, time brings redemption. Vehicles that were once unpopular or problematic often gain value as classic cars, with enthusiasts appreciating them for what they were rather than what they weren't. But the Citation has never quite achieved that status. Unlike other GM models from the same era, like the Chevrolet Camaro, Monte Carlo, or Corvette, the Citation never developed a strong enthusiast following. There are no major restoration clubs dedicated to preserving them, and they rarely appear at classic car shows. One reason for this is availability. When a car is rare, it often becomes more desirable. But in the case of the Citation, many examples simply didn't survive. Years of rust, mechanical failures, and poor build quality meant that most Citations were scrapped long before they could be considered collectible. The few that do remain tend to be owned by curious collectors, often more for the novelty than genuine admiration. Some people enjoy owning a Citation because of its history, as a conversation piece, rather than a beloved classic. Even the sportier Citation X11, which had better performance and a more aggressive design, hasn't gained much value in the collector's market. While some enthusiasts appreciate its rarity, it's still overshadowed by the car's overall reputation for unreliability. The Internet's role in keeping the Citation story alive. In the modern era, bad cars don't just disappear, they become legends on the Internet. The Chevrolet Citation has found a second life online, where automotive journalists, YouTubers, and historians continue to analyze what went wrong. The car is frequently mentioned in worst cars of all time lists, and it's a popular topic for discussions about GM's missteps. Videos and articles about the Citation consistently draw interest, proving that even decades later, people are still fascinated by its story. This digital resurrection has led some to reconsider the Citation in a new light. While it's still widely regarded as a failure, there's also a growing appreciation for its impact on the industry. Some argue that without the Citation's mistakes, GM might never have been forced to improve its quality control and engineering standards. In that sense, the Citation's failure wasn't just a loss for GM, it was a lesson that reshaped American car manufacturing. The personal stories, owners who never forgot their Citation. For every review, article, or video about the Citation, there are always personal stories from former owners. And while many of them are filled with frustration, some owners look back with a mix of fondness and disbelief. Some remember their Citation as the first new car they ever bought, a vehicle that, despite its flaws, still represents a part of their past. Others recall the many breakdowns, repair bills, and moments of regret that came with owning one. One common theme among Citation owners is disappointment. They didn't buy the car expecting perfection, they bought it because it was supposed to be the best GM had to offer. They trusted the brand, only to be let down by quality issues that should have been caught before the car even left the factory. For some, the Citation became the reason they never bought another GM vehicle again. For others, it was simply a reminder that even the biggest companies can make big mistakes. How the Citation fits into GM's larger history. General Motors has built some of the most iconic cars in automotive history. From the Chevrolet Bel Air to the Cadillac Eldorado, the company has produced vehicles that have defined generations. But for every success story, there's a cautionary tale. And the Citation is one of the biggest. It represents a moment when GM, despite its size and influence, got it wrong. When corporate decisions, cost-cutting, and rushed development led to a product that failed to live up to expectations. Yet, in a strange way, the Citation's failure also highlights the resilience of the automotive industry. GM survived, learned from its mistakes, and eventually found ways to rebuild its reputation. But the lesson was clear, even the biggest names in the business aren't immune to failure. The Citation may not be a classic in the traditional sense, but it is an unforgettable part of automotive history. And for that reason, it remains a car that people continue to talk about, debate, and remember, even if not always for the right reasons. The Chevrolet Citation wasn't just another failed model, it became a symbol of what happens when a company rushes innovation without ensuring long-term quality. For General Motors, the aftermath of the Citation was more than just disappointing sales figures. It forced the company to rethink its approach to engineering, manufacturing, and customer trust. The loss of consumer confidence. Before the Citation, General Motors had been an untouchable giant. American buyers trusted the brand almost without question. A Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, or Cadillac meant reliability, comfort, and familiarity. But the Citation changed that. When the defects started surfacing, ranging from braking issues to excessive rust and mechanical failures, customers felt betrayed. They hadn't just bought a flawed car, they had bought into a promise that GM failed to keep. Many former Citation owners never returned to GM, shifting their loyalty to Ford, Chrysler, or even Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda. This was a turning point in the American auto industry. For years, GM had dominated the market, assuming customers would always stick with their products. But the Citation proved that even the biggest brands weren't immune to reputation damage. By the mid-1980s, GM was no longer just competing with domestic rivals, it was now facing a rising wave of high-quality, fuel-efficient Japanese cars that consumers trusted more. The Citation had not only failed, it had pushed people toward the competition. The end of the X-body platform. After the Citation's decline, GM realized that its entire approach to compact front-wheel drive cars needed a rethink. The X-body platform, which was supposed to lead GM into the future, had instead become a liability. By 1985, the Citation was quietly discontinued, and the other X-body cars, like the Buick Skylark, Oldsmobile Omega, and Pontiac Phoenix, also disappeared. GM didn't just replace the Citation with another version, it abandoned the X-body platform altogether. This was an admission of failure. The company had spent years developing the platform, but its reputation had been damaged beyond repair. GM needed a fresh start. The transition to the A-body cars. After the Citation, GM didn't give up on front-wheel drive cars, but it did approach them differently. Instead of tweaking the X-body, GM developed the A-body platform, which would go on to power models like Chevrolet Celebrity, Buick Century, Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra, Pontiac 6000. These cars were still front-wheel drive, but they were built with less radical changes and more traditional designs. GM had learned a hard lesson: customers weren't just looking for innovation, they wanted trustworthy, well-built cars. The A-body cars weren't perfect, but they avoided the major failures of the Citation. They were more refined, had fewer recalls, and lasted much longer on the road. While the Citation had tried to revolutionize GM's compact lineup in one bold step, the A-body cars took a more cautious, reliable path forward. The lingering damage to GM's reputation. Even though the Citation was gone by the mid-1980s, its impact lasted much longer. It became a key example of why GM was struggling to compete with Japanese automakers. While Toyota and Honda were focused on long-term reliability and customer satisfaction, GM had been caught cutting corners and rushing development. The Citation's failure showed the world that GM's old way of doing business wasn't working anymore. By the 1990s, GM was still trying to rebuild its reputation, but the damage had been done. The Japanese brands had taken a firm hold on the American market, and even domestic competitors like Ford had learned from GM's mistakes. Did GM ever redeem itself? Over the years, GM made several attempts to win back customers who had lost faith after the Citation disaster. Some of these efforts included improving quality control in the late 1980s and early 1990s, introducing extended warranties to reassure customers, investing in new technology and better materials. But despite these efforts, the stigma remained. Many buyers who had bad experiences with the Citation or other problematic GM cars in the 1980s never returned to the brand. The Chevrolet Citation wasn't just a failed car, it was a moment of reckoning for General Motors. It forced the company to confront the consequences of cutting corners, underestimating competition, and breaking consumer trust. Why the Citation's legacy still matters. Even today, the Citation serves as a cautionary tale in the automotive industry. Car manufacturers constantly look back at failures like the Citation to remind themselves what happens when innovation is rushed without proper execution. For car enthusiasts, the Citation remains a fascinating piece of history, not because it was great, but because it was a failure that changed the industry. It was the car that proved even a powerhouse like GM was vulnerable if it didn't put quality first. While Chevrolet has moved far beyond the Citation, the memory of its failure still lingers. It's a reminder that in the car business, trust is everything, and once it's lost, it's incredibly difficult to get back. The Chevrolet Citation didn't just fail as a car, it became a symbol of everything that was going wrong with General Motors in the 1980s. It exposed deeper issues that had been building for years. At first, GM assumed the Citation's failure was just a temporary setback. But as time went on, it became clear that this car had damaged the company in ways no one had expected. It wasn't just about poor engineering or rushed production. The Citation had shaken consumer confidence in a way that GM would struggle to recover from for decades. The engineering shortcuts that led to disaster. Before the Citation, GM had a reputation for building cars that were solid, dependable, and long-lasting. But with this model, something changed. Instead of prioritizing quality, GM took shortcuts to save money and meet deadlines. The biggest problem was the car's unrefined front-wheel drive system. While front-wheel drive was supposed to make the Citation more efficient and spacious, GM rushed the development without fully testing how the system would hold up over time. Customers quickly found out that the brakes were unpredictable, sometimes pulling to one side when stopping. The transmissions were unreliable, often failing far sooner than expected. Rust issues plagued the car's underbody, especially in regions where winters were harsh. These weren't just minor annoyances, they were serious safety concerns that turned buyers away from the brand. Instead of creating excitement around GM's shift to compact, fuel-efficient cars, the Citation made people question GM's ability to build reliable vehicles at all. The sales success that quickly turned into a disaster. What made the Citation's failure even worse was how well it sold at first. In 1980, the car had a massive launch. GM dealers couldn't keep up with demand. People lined up to buy this modern, fuel-efficient American car. But then, as the defects started appearing, the excitement turned into regret. Many Citation owners felt deceived, they had trusted GM's promise of innovation, only to end up with a car full of mechanical issues. By the time GM started addressing the problems, it was too late. The damage was done. Word of mouth spread quickly, and buyers became skeptical of any new GM compact cars. Why the Citation marked the decline of GM's market domination. For decades, GM had been the undisputed king of the American auto industry. In the 1960s and 1970s, Chevrolet alone sold more cars than some entire automakers. But the Citation marked the beginning of a shift. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, GM's once loyal customers started looking elsewhere. Japanese automakers, like Toyota and Honda, were already gaining ground. But the Citation helped accelerate their rise. While GM was struggling with quality issues, Toyota was selling the Corolla and Camry, cars that were known for reliability, longevity, and low maintenance costs. Ford and Chrysler also learned from GM's mistakes. Instead of rushing out half-baked designs, they took their time refining their compact car offerings. Ford's Taurus and Escort became huge successes, proving that an American automaker could compete with the Japanese if they focused on quality.